This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Shane Morris. Shane, I think one of the best lines to start the year was January 1st. Happy New Year. January 2nd. War almost breaks out. Boy, that escalated quickly. In other words, we're off to a bang at the start of the year, and this week is no less. I mean, good heavens. I think we went into this week thinking we were, facing a long-term war with Iran. That seems to have at least petered out for now. Fascinating and tragic set of events, so more on that here in just a second. But before we jump in on that, I just want to just remember something. I think it was the 8th of January. So Wednesday of this past week was the anniversary of a remarkable story in the middle of the 20th century that inspired thousands, millions. I was one of them. 5 missionaries, and most famously a guy named Jim Elliot, trying to reach an unreached tribe, the Auca Indians in Ecuador, were speared on the beaches of a river in Ecuador, and an event that ended up being on the front page of Time magazine. The stuff of legend at youth conferences and mission conferences. Just a remarkable thing. And I just realized, this week that it was the anniversary of that story, and thought, when there's so many things kind of immediately crazy to talk about, let's stop for a moment and remember this.
Well, which one's going to have more eternal significance? I think that's a question we can rightly ask ourselves. And it comes to mind for me when contemplating something like that. I mean, these men had an eternal perspective in a way that's difficult for many of us to grasp, that their lives on this earth could be worth giving up for the eternal lives of strangers, people they've never met, who mean them harm. What a countercultural, a supernatural thing to think and believe and live by. I mean, that's why the story inspires us, because it's the perfect example of that Christian focus on the life to come rather than this life.
Yeah, and that's the quote, right? That's the quote that lives on for Jim Elliot. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Many people are familiar with Jim Elliot's story, mainly because the main storyteller of this whole saga is Elizabeth Elliot, and just a remarkable Christian writer, author, inspirational writer, known for all kinds of books, who passed away not that long ago. But basically, you have a headhunting tribe, the Auca Indians, and right around New Year's, these 5 men in 1956, these 5 men who had given their lives to mission work, he decided to go reach them. And after kind of an initially successful encounter with one of the missionaries, they attempted to go back. And that is when things, just completely went south. And their bodies were found with spears in the river. As I understand it, they had a firearm, chose not to use it, and which is an interesting conversation given some of the recent stories that you and I have talked about here, including the church in Texas. But there's just, all of these men were remarkable in their own ways. I was first exposed to their story through reading Through Gates of Splendor, which is the book that Elizabeth Elliot wrote of this whole account. Included also bits and pieces of their own, kind of dating relationship and courting relationship. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but that Through Gates of Splendor title comes from a hymn that the 5 men sung before meeting trying to initiate kind of the first contact with the Aucas. The song, the verse goes, "We rest on thee, our shield and our defender. Thine is the battle, thine will be the praise. When passing through the gates of pearly splendor, victors, we rest on thee through endless days." And as I understand it as well, when word came back that the men were missing and ultimately found, the 5 widows of these 5 missionaries sang that same song as a hymn of mourning and a hymn of praise. I was also struck, too, by the story of Nate Saint. He has a wonderful book that I think it was his wife wrote, called Jungle Pilot. Talks about the night before the 5 men were to go and establish their base there in a tree house by the river, and that he was praying with their kids, doing their family devotions, and had read through the story of Noah. And he had prayed that, God, please let us, like Noah, do whatever the Lord asks us to do. Of course, you kind of read back and you realize, look, the commitments made without the benefit of any sort of hindsight. And of course, the hindsight of the story, Shane, which is remarkable, is that Elizabeth Elliot actually goes back and lives with the Aucas for years, and that whole tribe now has come to Christ. In fact, Nate Saint's son was baptized by the man that they think killed his father. It's just one of those things that too good for Hollywood story, which is an appropriate reference given that the Golden Globes were this week. More on that in just a second, right?
Yeah, from the sublime to the vulgar, or however the saying goes. There's a line in at least in the End of the Spear movie, and I don't know if it's original or if it's something that one of the missionaries had said in passing before that got added to the film. But one of the missionaries pulls out the gun that they had there on the riverbank in the plane. And the other says, "Don't use that. We're ready. We're ready to die. They're not. They're not ready for this." And that kind of eternal perspective is just what wows me about the whole story. These missionaries took to heart Romans 10. How then can they call on him who they've not believed in, and how can they believe in the one whom they've not heard? That's the impetus behind missions, right? To bring the message.
Yeah, there's a wonderful summary of this story that we'll link to. If you come to breakpoint.org and click on the link there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, we'll link you to a wonderful account of this story that is told. And of course, I would also, of course, recommend the book Through Gates of Splendor and the book Jungle Pilot. But I'm just struck because there's so many things that draw our attention to the temporal. There's so many ways in which our world has, as Charles Taylor famously has said, become disenchanted. And just that line in and of itself, there's a frame of reference, there's a backdrop to one's belief system that's reflected in that line. We're ready to go, they're not. That is just, there's just a thought of a way of seeing the world. And of course, that's what the Colson Center exists to do, is to help think through a Christian worldview. And you just kind of have these moments of stark contrast where you realize there's a different way of seeing the world that many of us just don't have. That we just don't. We're too modern. We're too contemporary. We don't think that way. And Lord, give us some of those perspectives as we go into the new year. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here, along with Shane Morris, talking about the stories of the culture from a Christian worldview. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here, along with Shane Morris. Shane, as I said, we spent a lot of time last week talking about kind of just war tradition to the decision by President Trump to take out General Soleimani. Of course, in the words of, or in the thoughts of many, escalating the United States and Iran to the brink of war, not knowing where this was going to go, but also looking specifically at the justification of provocation that many have tried to work through. Also, this past week on our podcast, I talked to Daryl Charles, who has written probably more on the just war tradition than anybody else. And don't miss that if you did. It was a fantastic, I think, conversation and a summary of how people have put this together. And of course, we've got a story like what we just talked about, where the missionaries were on the beach making that individual decision. I'm ready to die, they're not ready to die, which is a different sort of calculation than a nation trying to protect its citizens. And these are very, very difficult and complicated things. And we don't want to kind of run in and justify an action because, a bad guy has been kind of removed from the scene, which is certainly what happened with General Soleimani. But the crazy thing, Shane, is that anything we thought about, a whole lot happened since we had that conversation, and what looks like a remarkable foreign policy decision by the president. We're now, as he said in his speech, Iran has stood down and is dealing with its own mess because of a 737 that an errant missile, brought down, tragically killing 176 people on board. One wonders, was that part of this calculation for Iran to kind of send some telegraph shelling into Iraq and then basically to kind of keep face with its own people and then completely back down, which is what the president promised? Yeah,
it's interesting. Did President Trump read the message there, the face-saving message, or was it his advisors behind the scenes who sort of said, hey, Mr. President, you might want to de-escalate your Twitter rhetoric a little bit because Iran is giving you an off-ramp here from war, and you need to take it. And that was what was so remarkable about the the speech, John, was, and I'm normally quite a dove myself. I think this country's gotten involved in a lot of ill-advised military adventures, even in my lifetime. So I was just thrilled to see the president get up there and soberly describe a course of restraint where we're going to, increase sanctions on Iran, but back off from a military conflict at this point, that Iran is de-escalating. We're not going to go to war. We're not going to engage in some new vast, far-reaching conflict here. I think it was a wise decision as far as I can see from this point. But, the just war questions are complicated by things like the Ukrainian Airlines flight that was shot down. As far as U.S. intelligence seems to be concerned, and as far as I can tell at this point, they think it was an accident. It was a series of civilian casualties that was inadvertent, right? Iran did not intend to shoot down the plane. But that's what happens when war is conducted. And so we need to take that into consideration when we're making grave and heavy decisions like this.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of seems from this side of it, again, hindsight's 2020, that I forget what the Iranian Twitter account said about some kind of overwhelming response, which was essentially they called Iraq and said, "Hey, we're about to shell your bases. Make sure you hide everyone." Right. They knocked down a few buildings and then they backed down. Now, whether some of this escalation immediately stopped the moment that this Ukrainian International Airlines plane was inadvertently shot down, or whether that was the plan all along. It's a great question. I can't think that Iran, if it were clear thinking, would want to actually join the escalation and go to war against the United States. I mean, early in the week, it was promising, strikes against Israel and against Dubai. I mean, it was amazing to kind of hear what they were saying and thinking that this isn't going away anytime soon. And yet, in a matter of 24 hours, here we are. I think when you talk about just war thinking and trying to justify, okay, and again, some of this, you go in with the information that you have and you turn around and you look back with what you now know at the end. And, this awful event where, 176 people who were just kind of taking off from Tehran's airport get hit by an inadvertent missile. If that's indeed what, happened, whose responsibility is that? Is that the United States for making a decision early in Soleimani? This is what you don't see when you make a decision and these things kind of escalate. Or was it incompetence on the part of Iran, which is what it looks like right now? And who's to blame for that?
Yeah.
And this is, but again, as you said, no one celebrates this. No one celebrates, everyone celebrates the fact that we're not escalating it further. No one celebrates the fact that 176 people, inadvertent casualties, that took place. No one can celebrate that. We'll continue to watch this story. I don't think it's going away either. But wow. The other group that's certainly not helping themselves in this whole story, Shane, again, and I don't know how many times we can have this conversation, is the media, is the press. I mean, we went from the beginning of the week, President Trump has escalated tensions to after his speech and after announcing that Iran largely has stood down, basically them trying to fulfill the prophecy that they gave at the beginning of the week that didn't come true. I mean, it was really something, wasn't it? I mean, I listened to probably far too many news reports and commentaries and NPR conversations that were just essentially trying to stoke fires that weren't ultimately stoked by the president or Iran. I just found it just absolutely stunning.
Yeah, World War III averted. We now return to our regularly scheduled program. It's I mean, yeah, there's an element of that. I don't really care what the media says about the president in this point too much, because I'm just so happy with the decision that was made there. I think that's the right decision. Yeah, war is serious, and part of being just with how we start and then prosecute war is having a very, very high bar for entering it.
Well, and in stopping it when once the time is ready to stop, right? I mean, and I think that's what happened. But again, is that the headline or is that the reality? It's kind of hard to tell. Well, we'll be back in just a second to talk about the Golden Globes, so don't miss that. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. Shane Morris here, along with John Stonestreet. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. And as we talk about bracing ourselves for a culture in crisis, we're for escalating tensions, let's just recall that, hey, award season is upon us, which is a domestic form of terrorism. I don't know if I could say that out loud. Should I say that? Maybe we should go back in post-production and edit that line. I don't know.
Please
but
no.
Look, the Golden Globes, the Golden Globes start us off. Here, look. I want to talk about Ricky Gervais's opening monologue, which created a lot of discussion, and certainly Michelle Williams crediting abortion for her Hollywood success is something that needs to be talked about as well. But before we get there, can we just say this? There is a level of self-importance that comes out in these award shows. It's one thing to celebrate good art and good storytelling. Award shows and award season goes far beyond that, Shane. It goes to, Hollywood celebrating itself for changing the world, for being the most important people on the planet, for, fighting courageously the power of despots and tyrants and climate change. And, it just, to me, it just gets so irritating, and yet at the same time, it's like a train wreck. I can't look away. And especially the Golden Globes, which is known as the drunk Oscars. It's like before we get serious at the Oscars, let's get hammered and do the same thing. I don't know. Do you have the same feeling about award shows? It just seems so far over the top. It's either like somebody trying to say something particularly edgy, using the spotlight to say something particularly political. I don't know. It's just exhausting to me.
Well, yeah, the moral preening at the award shows seems to be the story every year, right? I mean, I don't particularly care about what goes on at the award shows otherwise, but it's what makes the headlines are these self-important moral pronouncements and congratulations. I mean, it's a giant back-patting fest. But yeah, this time Ricky Gervais took the opportunity to use that tendency and turn it around and attack Hollywood executives and celebrities and really just roast them. I mean, and he really roasted them.
Well, he really did roast them. But, but think about it. I mean, again, you would think coming out of the Harvey Weinstein, I mean, this is actually the week of the Harvey Weinstein trial starting, I think, right? I mean, isn't the trial starting like right now? And so this is when the Golden Globes are happening. They aided and abetted this guy. Whether we're talking about the news networks, whether we're talking about the power players. I mean, there was a mashup that I saw this week of the number of celebrities getting up and thanking Harvey Weinstein, and all the things that he's done for them and why he's such a force of nature. And, basically one of the most notorious long-term cover-ups of sexual abuse and a sexual predator in history happening right out of Hollywood, and yet then we're turned around and lectured by these guys. That you see my point? I mean, that's my problem.
Yeah, like you said, actors and celebrities lecture each other and the public on everything from global warming to women's rights to racism to gender inclusivity. And Gervais, of all people, has the guts to stand up there and say what most of us, I think, are already thinking, that the industry is a whitewashed tomb, to borrow Jesus' metaphor. It's bright and social.
But let's be clear, Ricky Gervais did not quote Jesus.
No, he did not. No,
we need to be.
I'm quoting.
Yeah, he did not. Ricky Gervais would not quote Jesus. I mean, we're talking about kind of a crude atheist who was on his last gig, and that's how he actually started it. Like, I don't care anymore. Apparently, they don't care because they keep inviting me back. There was this, remarkable line about who was it? One celebrity at the Oscars last year got disinvited because of an old tweet. And he's like, he got disinvited from an old tweet. Clearly, the Golden Globes don't care, given his Twitter, Ricky Gervais's Twitter account. Shane, read what he said. I mean, it really was one of his most, at least that one line about, the Hollywood tendency to lecture.
Oh, there
people.
were really three. There were three real zingers. First, he said, "You're in no position to lecture the public about anything. You know nothing about the real world. Most of you spent less time in school than Greta Thunberg," which of course is great because
right. And this was after he said, when you come up here, if you do happen to win an award, don't say anything political. Yeah. Right. He just said, you're in no position to lecture the real world.
Yeah. The best one had to have been where he said, "Our next presenter starred in Netflix's Bird Box, a movie where people survive by acting like they don't see a thing, sort of like working for Harvey Weinstein." Ooh.
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to celebrate Ricky Gervais as a spokesperson for anything, but it was he did say a lot of hard truths about an industry that really needs it, and yet that didn't stop Michelle Williams, did it? It didn't stop Michelle Williams and others from political posturing. It was a remarkable speech in a negative way. I mean, you have to actually listen to what she says. Michelle Williams winning for Best Actress in a Limited Series or Motion Picture Made for TV said this: "I'm grateful for the acknowledgement of the choices I've made. And I'm also grateful to have lived in a moment in our society where choice exists. Because as women and as girls, things can happen to our bodies that are not our choice." Let's stop right there. Obviously, she's talking about abortion, and she's going to go even further into it. And of course, the story here is not just what she said, but the reaction of the audience, to cheer and to yell, kind of like at a Democratic National Convention when abortion comes up. The thing that we have to say is again, this line: because as women and girls, things can happen to our bodies that are not our choice. We have a What Would You Say video. That's our new series helping Christians answer very difficult cultural questions on the topic of rape and incest. And one of the points that Stephanie Gray brings up in that terrific video, and again, we'll link it if you come to breakpoint.org in the show notes for the program today. One of the things she brings up is that this line is so often used to justify abortion in general, which, for the record, Michelle Williams is going to go ahead and do in just a second. Right. But this is such a red herring because, whenever someone brings that up to me, and I speak to students all summer, and a lot of times they'll ask me this: well, what about abortion in cases of rape and incest? And I say, well, look, let's deal with that in just a second. But before we get here, let's just say this. What if I gave you that? What if I gave you abortion only in cases of rape and incest? Right? Can we then have a real conversation about abortion in all the other cases, which for the record is over 98%? Can we at least have that conversation? So first of all, she throws out a red herring, right? Then she says this: "I've tried my very best to live a life of my own making. Not just a series of events that happened to me, but one that I could stand back and look at and recognize my handwriting all over, as if pregnancy often happens to people and they have no choice in the matter." Again, that's 98% of the time we're talking about something else. "Sometimes messy and scrawling, sometimes careful and precise, but one that I carved with my own hand. And I wouldn't have been able to do this without employing a woman's right to choose when to have my children and with whom." And the audience erupts. Shane, go.
Oh. This idea, John, that women need to kill their children or have the option of killing their children in order to succeed, it to me is such an obvious failure of moral imagination. You see it lurking behind basically all pro-choice activism. You mentioned the rape and incest exceptions, and several pro-life apologists that I've heard have done a great job of taking that apart, where they say, all right, look, I'll either give you that, or let's talk about the 98% of abortions that are elective, as opposed to, dealing with these cases. And let's talk about that, because the unspoken justification for abortions, and often the spoken justification in the case of Michelle Williams, is that my career would have been impossible without this. Like, I need to get children out of the way in order to succeed in life. And that this is akin to losing my life or having to give up the most precious thing to me if I can't make this career happen. And that's just, first of all, it's just a lie. As the who was it when the French Prime Minister, right, Macron, when he said that he's never met a successful woman with kids or more than a few kids. I can't remember the exact quote. And then he got this huge
he got this huge
backlash on Twitter from women who are successful and have done all these great things and say, oh, and I have this many kids and this many kids. It's first of all, it's a lie, but second of all, even if it were true, how barbaric. You're going to sacrifice your kids to succeed in life. And watching her, John, I'm not sure she believes it herself. I always see this sort of expression in the midst of that self-justification, and it was encapsulated in several cartoons, but there was one really powerful one where she's up there accepting her award, and she says, "I won," and then there's a mother beside her holding a child, and she says, "No, you didn't."
Yeah, that's right. Probably in the harshest critique, somebody said that, this gives whole new meaning to the old tired cliche, I'd give my firstborn child to be in the movies. But literally, that's what's being said. And it's an awful thing to point out, but it really is. But even beyond that, this idea, and I think if people like Mary Eberstadt have written about this and others, this idea that abortion gives women the upward mobility to success is, I think, a talking point of the male-initiated sexual revolution. I mean, really, abortion has proven to be much more of a get-out-of-jail-free card for men, and not tying men down than it has women. And women are victims of this sort of idea as well, where they're kind of told, I mean, think about it. It's the same sort of mentality that has kind of elevated Harvey Weinstein and kept his sin hidden for so long. It's just one of the great lies of the sexual revolution, that it promised women freedom through abortion, and it really just gave them an awful lot of in many cases, blood on their hands, and also gave the man who got what he wanted a get-out-of-jail-free card. And it's just really a tragic thing. And before we end, let me also just say this. I don't think abortion should be justified in the cases of rape or incest either, because just because there's one victim doesn't mean that there should be two. Amen. And to hear more about that, this is a very, very important What Would You Say video that came out just before Christmas. And don't miss that series, because these talking points that we often hear is exactly what we're trying to tackle with that series. You're in a conversation and someone says X, Y, and Z. What would you say? And now we have 15, 16 videos out, over 100,000 views, 4,000 subscribers, and it's growing every day of Christians who just want to have the talking points necessary in order to respond in conversation when these things are thrown out as if there are kind of conversation killers. You just go to whatwouldyousay.org. That's whatwouldyousay.org. Well, we're out of time. Join us again next week. We'll talk about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. You've been listening to Breakpoint This Week. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.